Imagine this, a cocky Earth stud accidentally turns a stunning alien scientist into a curvy knockout, boobs and hips popping like a sci-fi fantasy gone wild. Out in the serious stars, Commander Jake's dumb button mash leaves Lyraxa, a green-skinned babe with sexy rabbit ears, tripping over her own hot mess. Her perfect alien tribe wants her gone, but Jake. He's all in hands-on fixes, steamy touches, and a mind link that spills their dirtiest thoughts. Dodging drones, defying a snobby council, and racing against exile, they're stuck between fixing her or falling hard. Will they ditch the rules for a cosmic love affair? Dive into stellar seduction. It's flirty, wild, and way too hot to miss. Smash that subscribe on Alien Whispers for more interstellar spice. Commander Jake Blaze Carter swaggered down the shiny halls of Orion 7, his heavy boots thumping against the slick metal floor. Sweat glistened on his forehead, trickling down his temple, and he swiped it away with a rough hand, flexing his thick biceps under a tight black combat vest. The station floated above a wild gas giant in the Sirius system, a swirling mess of purple and orange that glowed through the huge windows like a tripped-out dream. Out here, Earth's rules didn't mean squat. This was the spot for crazy experiments, stuff too freaky for the folks back home to handle. Weird alien gadgets lined the walls, floating screens flashed with symbols he couldn't read, and machines buzzed low, sending little vibrations up his legs. Jake grinned, tugging at his vest. Another day in the cosmic zoo, he muttered. The air conditioning was busted again, shocker, and the heat made his vest stick to his skin. Not that he minded. It showed off his ripped arms, and he'd caught half the crew, humans and aliens, ogling them all week. He'd been stuck on this floating tin can for 8 months, sent by Earth to babysit a project with the Lyraxans. They were these fancy green-skinned aliens with long rabbit ears and a weird hang-up about looking perfect. Thin, sleek bodies were their jam. Curves. Total turn-off for them. Whatever. Jake didn't care about their beauty pageant crap. He stopped at a door labeled Xenobiology Enhancement Lab, its glowing blue runes giving off a sci-fi vibe. He smacked his hand on the scanner, and the door whooshed open, letting out a cool draft that hit his sweaty chest. Inside, the room pulsed with blue light, packed with high-tech toys, tubes bubbling with bright goo, scanners humming like they were alive. And right in the middle stood Lyraxa, the station's top brainiac. She spun around when she heard him, her rabbit ears popping up like she'd just spotted prey. Her green skin sparkled like a damn jewel under the lab lights, and those golden eyes of hers hit him like a laser, sharp and hot. Her silver hair flowed down her back, catching the glow, and her tight silver tunic hugged every inch of her slim frame, smooth as glass. "Commander Carter," she said, her voice sliding out soft and musical, like it could melt steel. "Thanks for getting here so quick. I need your help with something tricky." Jake strolled over, boots clacking, and flashed his cockiest grin. "What's up, Lyraxa? Another toy you can't figure out?" His eyes landed on a slick gadget on her table, some shiny remote-looking thing with no labels, just a few buttons glowing red, blue, and green. Lyraxa waved a hand at it, her fingers long and graceful. "The Galactic Council sent this for our body mod work, medical tweaks, Valerian-style perfection. But the instructions? Total garbage." Jake snatched it up, flipping it in his hands. It felt solid, cool against his palm. No labels. That's nuts. How do you even use it? Lyraxa's lips twitched into a tiny smile, almost teasing. "We trust our gut. You humans. You just smash buttons." Before she could stop him, Jake's thumb hit the red one. A loud bzzzzzt ripped through the air, and a green beam shot out, wrapping Lyraxa in a shimmering haze. She let out a yelp, her ears flopping down as the light faded. Jake's eyes nearly popped out of his head. Her chest ballooned forward, stretching her tunic tight with a pair of full, heavy breasts that begged to bust free. Her hips flared out wide, and her backside rounded into a juicy curve that made his throat go dry. She stumbled, grabbing the table, her new weight throwing her off. "Jake! What the hell did you do?" she shouted, her green face turning a bright, embarrassed red. To Valyrians, this was a nightmare. Big boobs and a thick butt were sloppy, ugly, everything they hated. Jake tried not to laugh, rubbing his neck. My bad. Guess you're rocking a new kind of perfect now." Lyraxa's ears flattened, and she shot him a death glare. "This isn't funny, you idiot." The lab turned into a mess real quick. Lyraxa wobbled, her new curves jiggling as she tried to stand straight. Her tunic creaked, barely holding on, and Jake stepped closer, reaching out. "Whoa, easy there," he said, his rough hand brushing her arm. Her skin felt smooth and warm, like heated silk, and a little spark jumped between them. She jerked back, but not before his fingers grazed down to her wrist, firm and slow. "Don't grab me like that," she snapped, her voice shaky, ears twitching hard. Jake smirked, leaning in just enough to catch a whiff of her, something sweet, alien, and way too tempting. "Can't help it? You're kinda hard to ignore now." She glared, but her golden eyes flickered, locked on his, and her breath hitched. Jake's hand slid up to her shoulder, giving it a light squeeze, feeling the heat radiating off her. "Relax, we'll fix this," he said, his voice dropping low, thumb brushing her collarbone for a split second. Her ears quivered, and her face flushed deeper, that green skin glowing like a neon sign. "You're impossible," she muttered, shoving his hand off, but her fingers lingered on his knuckles, soft and hesitant, before she pulled away. Jake grinned wider. This was gonna be fun and hotter than he'd expected. The lab turned into a damn circus faster than Jake could blink. Lyraxa staggered around, her new curvy body throwing her off like she'd just stepped off a spinning ship. "This is a freaking disaster," she groaned, clutching the workbench with both hands, her long rabbit ears twitching like they were about to snap off. Her silver tunic stretched tight across her chest, the fabric screaming as her full breasts pushed against it, and her hips swayed wide, that round backside bouncing with every shaky step. Jake hovered nearby, biting his lip to keep from grinning like an idiot. She looked hot, way hotter than she'd ever admit, and he couldn't peel his eyes off her. "Need a hand, Doc?" he asked, stepping in close. His rough fingers brushed her smooth green arm as he steadied her, and a jolt hit him, warm, electric, like touching a live wire. Her skin was soft, too soft, and he couldn't help sliding his grip down a little, feeling the heat under his palm. Lyraxa's golden eyes shot up, wide and flustered, her ears quivering hard. "Don't grab me like that, Jake," she snapped, but her voice cracked, and her green cheeks flushed a deep, sexy red. Jake's smirk grew. "What? Just trying to help. You're too cute when you're mad." They had 12 hours, 12 measly hours before the Valyrian Council rolled in, and if they caught Lyraxa looking like a sci-fi bombshell, it'd be game over. Jake grabbed the damn device, holding it steady while Lyraxa hooked it up to the lab's main console, a glowing tower of lights and floating screens that looked like something out of a movie. She leaned in close, her silver hair brushing his cheek, soft as a feather and smelling like some alien flower he couldn't name. His heart kicked up, thumping loud in his chest. "Keep it still," she said, her slim fingers wrapping around his wrist to guide him. Her touch was firm, warm, and lingered way longer than it needed to, her nails grazing his skin just enough to make him swallow hard. "You're hotter than this busted station," he said, winking at her. Lyraxa yanked her hand back like she'd been burned, her ears shooting straight up as her face glowed redder than a warning light. "Focus, you jackass," she huffed, but the way her eyes darted away, all shy and rattled, told him she felt it too, the heat, the pull. Things got messy fast. Lyraxa stepped back to grab a scanner, but her new hips, wide and juicy, snagged on a loose cable snaking across the floor. She yelped, arms flailing, and Jake dove forward, catching her around the waist. His hand slid down, brushing the plump curve of her backside for a hot second before settling on her hips, gripping tight. She gasped, her rabbit ears trembling as his breath hit her neck, warm and rough. Her body pressed against his chest, soft and heavy in all the right places, and he could feel her heartbeat racing under his fingers. "You okay?" he asked, voice low and close, holding her tight enough to feel every inch of her against him. Her hands landed on his arms, fingers digging into his biceps, tracing the hard muscle there like she couldn't help herself. "Let go," she mumbled, pushing at him, but her touch lingered, sliding slow and shaky down his forearms before she broke free. Jake's blood was pumping now. She was rattled, and damn, it was turning him on. "Okay, we gotta cover this up," he said, shrugging off his leather jacket beat up, patched with old Earth Command logos, and tossed it over her shoulders. He stepped behind her, real close, his chest brushing her back as he draped it on. His fingers slid down her arms, slow and deliberate, feeling the smooth heat of her green skin under his rough hands. The jacket hung loose, but it couldn't hide how her curves popped underneath those full hips, that killer chest, and it looked sexy as hell in a messy, rebel way. "You look wild in this," he said, his voice dropping husky, hand resting on her shoulder a beat too long, thumb grazing the base of her neck. Lyraxa's ears drooped, her breath catching sharp as she tilted her head up at him. Her golden eyes locked on his, sparking with something confusion, maybe want, and the air between them buzzed like a live circuit. "This isn't perfect," she whispered, but her body leaned into his touch just a hair, like she didn't want him to stop. They worked late, the gas giant outside painting the lab in freaky shadows. Lyraxa's hands kept brushing his passing tools, tweaking wires, and every time, it was like a spark went off. Once, she handed him a wrench, and their fingers tangled, her soft green skin sliding against his calloused knuckles. She didn't pull back right away, and neither did he. "You're impossible," she muttered, but a tiny smile snuck onto her lips, shy and cute. Jake grinned back, leaning in so his shoulder bumped hers, feeling the warmth radiating off her. "Yeah, and you're stuck with me, babe." Later, she tripped again, this time over a damn chair, and Jake was there in a flash, one arm looping around her waist, the other catching her elbow. Her full chest pressed into him, soft and warm, and his hand slid up her side, brushing just under her ribs before settling back on her hip. She sucked in a breath, her ears twitching fast as his face hovered close, his lips near enough to feel her shaky exhale. "You gotta stop falling for me," he teased, voice rough and playful, his fingers flexing against her curves. Her hands gripped his vest, nails scraping the fabric as she steadied herself, and for a second, her touch lingered on his chest, feeling the hard planes underneath. "Shut up," she shot back, shoving him off, but her cheeks were blazing, and she couldn't hide the way her eyes flicked over him like she was checking him out too. Jake laughed, low and warm, the tension between them thick enough to choke on. This wasn't just a fix-it job anymore, it was something hotter, messy, and way more fun. The lab felt like a pressure cooker by the time Jake and Lyraxa figured out the real kicker, that damn device didn't just turn her into a curvy goddess, it had wired their brains together. It hit him like a freight train when she tripped again, this time over a stupid chair leg sticking out. Jake lunged forward, one hand snaking around her waist, the other grabbing her arm. His fingers slid low, brushing the full swell of her hips, soft, warm, and way too tempting, before gripping tight to steady her. She stumbled into him, her chest pressing against his, and a thought slammed into his head, clear as day, his hands feel too damn good, what's wrong with me? He froze, staring down at her, his pulse hammering. "Did you just say that in my head?" he asked, voice rough with shock. Lyraxa's rabbit ears shot straight up, her green face paling to a minty shade as her golden eyes went wide. "You heard that," she squeaked, her hands clutching his arm, nails digging into his skin. Their thoughts smashed together, her panic buzzing like static, his excitement roaring like a fire, and it left them both dizzy, reeling from the heat of it. The lab's blue glow softened everything, casting shadows that danced over Lyraxa's green skin as they stood side by side, hunched over the device's glowing screen. Jake reached across her to tweak a setting, his arm brushing her side, slow and deliberate. His fingers grazed the curve of her hip, feeling the warmth seeping through her tunic, and she shivered, her ears twitching fast. "Stop moving around," she breathed, her voice shaky, but her hand shot out, catching his wrist. She guided it back to the console, her touch lingering, soft and trembling as her fingers slid over his knuckles. Their eyes locked, gold meeting gray, and Jake leaned in close, his breath hot against her cheek. "You're the one driving me crazy," he said, low and gravelly, his lips so near hers he could feel the little hitch in her exhale. Her heart slammed against her ribs, he felt it, loud and wild through their link, and in one quick, burning second, their lips brushed. It was soft, electric, just a tease of heat before they pulled back, fast enough to keep it tame but long enough to leave them both wrecked. That mind link wasn't messing around, it grew stronger every damn minute. Jake could feel her thoughts now, sharp and raw, disgust at her gross curves, shame at how clumsy she'd gotten. But Lyraxa. She got hit with his side, two flashes of him staring at her, thinking how hot she looked, how those hips begged to be grabbed. "You humans are so weird," she thought, the words echoing in his skull, and he laughed out loud, a deep, rumbling sound. "Yeah, and you're eating it up," he shot back, grinning at her. She glared, but her cheeks flushed that sexy red again, and her ears drooped like she was caught. Later, Jake grabbed a mug of coffee black as the void outside and handed it to her, their fingers tangling as she took it. Her soft green skin slid against his rough hand, sending a jolt straight up his arm, and she didn't pull away fast this time. Instead, she leaned in, her shoulder pressing into his chest, warm and solid. "This link, it's risky as hell," she said, her voice trembling, her breath brushing his neck. Jake's hand moved before he could think, sliding up her arm, slow and firm, until it rested on her neck. His thumb traced her jawline, feeling the heat of her skin, the little pulse jumping under his touch. "Risky and freaking amazing," he replied, his voice dropping husky, their faces so close he could see every fleck of gold in her eyes. The air crackled, thick with heat, every look and touch pulling them deeper into something they couldn't shake. They kept working, the gas giant outside glaring through the windows like it was judging them. Lyraxa reached for a tool, and Jake beat her to it, his hand closing over hers. Their fingers locked, her smooth skin pressing into his calloused palm, and he didn't let go right away. He tugged her closer, just a little, until her hip bumped his thigh, soft and full against him. "You're gonna kill me with these hands," he muttered, half teasing, half serious, his free hand brushing her lower back, fingers splaying wide to feel the curve there. She sucked in a breath, her ears twitching like crazy, and her thoughts slipped through, "Why does this feel so good?" He smirked, catching her eye. "Because it does, babe," he said aloud, answering her mind like it was nothing. Her face went scarlet, and she shoved him off, but not before her hand trailed down his chest, fingers grazing the hard lines under his vest, leaving a trail of fire in their wake. The tension hit a breaking point near the end of the night. Lyraxa leaned over the console, fiddling with a wire, and Jake stepped up behind her, real close. His chest brushed her back, his hands landing on her hips to steady her as she wobbled, those damn curves still throwing her off. His fingers dug in just enough, feeling the warmth radiating off her, and she froze, her breath hitching loud. "Jake," she whispered, half warning, half something else, as his breath grazed her ear, hot and teasing. "Just keeping you upright," he murmured, his lips hovering near her neck, close enough to make her tremble. Her hands gripped the console, but one slid back, brushing his arm, her nails scraping lightly as she fought to focus. Their thoughts tangled, his wanting to pull her closer, hers screaming to push him away but not really meaning it. "We're so screwed," she muttered, and he chuckled, low and warm, his hands sliding up her sides, just under her ribs, before letting go. "Yeah, but it's worth it," he said, stepping back, leaving them both breathless and buzzing. The lab was humming with tension when a sharp beep cut through the air like a knife. Lyraxa's comm device lit up, glowing red on the workbench, and a cold, clipped voice crackled through Elder Vaxer, one of the Valerian Council's big shots. "Lyraxa, report your progress immediately," he barked, his tone sharp enough to slice metal. "The Council arrives in 12 hours. Any failure will disgrace our pursuit of perfection, and you know the consequences." The message blinked out, leaving a heavy silence. Lyraxa's rabbit ears drooped low, her hands trembling as she clutched Jake's arm, her fingers digging into his bicep. Her green skin felt warm against his, soft and alive, and her golden eyes flicked up to his, wide with fear. "They'll exile me if they see this mess," she whispered, her voice breaking. Jake slid his hand over hers, squeezing tight, pulling her in until her shoulder brushed his chest, the heat of her body seeping into him. "We'll fix it," he said, low and firm, his other hand resting on her waist, fingers splaying wide to feel the curve there. "No one's taking you away from me." She tensed, but her gaze softened, caught between panic and trust, and for a second, her hand pressed harder into his arm, like she needed his strength to hold her up. Hours ticked by, the clock mocking them with every second, and the lab turned into a war zone of wires and frustration. Jake slammed the device down on the table, the clang echoing loud. "This thing's a puzzle from hell," he snapped, running a hand through his sweaty hair, his vest sticking to his chest. Lyraxa paced nearby, her new curves jiggling awkwardly with every step, her silver tunic stretched tight over her chest and hips. "It's not just a machine, it's a damn test," she said, her voice tight, ears twitching fast. "If we fail, they'll lock me up for tainting our ideals, maybe worse." Jake stepped in front of her, blocking her path, and grabbed her shoulders, his hands firm but gentle. "Then we fight back," he said, his gray eyes burning into hers. "I'm not letting some stuck-up council ruin you." His fingers slid down her arms, slow and warm, lingering at her wrists, feeling the pulse racing under her green skin. She shook her head, ears quivering. "You can't fight them, Jake, they control everything here." But her body leaned into his touch, just a little, her breath hitching as his thumbs brushed the insides of her wrists. He grinned, that cocky smirk she couldn't stand but couldn't resist either. "Watch me," he said, stepping closer until their chests nearly touched, his hands sliding back up to her shoulders, gripping tight. "Humans don't quit, babe." Her golden eyes flickered, caught by his boldness, and she tilted her head up, their foreheads almost brushing. Her breath grazed his lips, warm and shaky, and for a heartbeat, the room shrank to just them, his rough hands on her smooth skin, her soft curves pressing into his hard frame. "You're insane," she muttered, but her hand slid up his arms, fingers tracing the lines of his muscles, lingering on his biceps like she couldn't pull away. Jake's pulse kicked up, and he let one hand drift down her side, brushing the swell of her hip, feeling the heat radiating off her. "Insane and all yours," he teased, voice dropping low, and her cheeks flushed that sexy red again, her ears twitching like she was fighting a smile. The debate heated up as the night dragged on. Lyraxa yanked a scanner from the wall, her movements jerky, and Jake stepped behind her, reaching over to steady her hand. His chest pressed into her back, solid and warm, and his arm slid around her waist, fingers splaying across her stomach to hold her still. "Slow down," he murmured, his lips brushing her ear, his breath hot against her neck. She froze, a shiver running through her, and her thoughts slipped through their link. Why does he feel so good? He chuckled, catching it, and tightened his grip just enough to feel her curves mold against him. "Because I do," he whispered back, his hand sliding up her side, grazing just under her ribs before settling on her hip again. She sucked in a breath, her ears trembling, and shoved him off, but not before her hand brushed his chest, nails scraping his vest as she pulled away. "You're making this harder," she snapped, but her voice was shaky, and her eyes darted over him flustered, wanting, scared. They circled back to the device, the air thick with unspoken heat. Jake leaned over the table, tweaking a wire, and Lyraxa stepped up beside him, her shoulder bumping his. Her hand brushed his as she reached for a tool, and he caught her fingers, tangling them with his own. Her skin was soft, warm, and he tugged her closer, his thumb stroking her palm slow and deliberate. "We're running out of time," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but she didn't pull back. Her hip pressed into his thigh, full and tempting, and he slid his free hand up her arm, resting it on her neck, feeling the pulse hammering there. "Then we make it count," he said, his voice rough, his thumb tracing her jawline, slow and hot. Her breath hitched, her thoughts flooding his mind. "I shouldn't want this." He grinned, leaning in until his lips hovered near hers, close enough to feel her tremble. "Yeah, but you do," he said aloud, answering her, and her hand gripped his vest, fingers digging in like she was holding on for dear life. The comm beeped again, Vaxer's voice, colder this time. "No excuses, Lyraxa. Perfection demands sacrifice." She flinched, breaking free, but Jake grabbed her wrist, pulling her back. His hand slid up to her elbow, firm and warm, and he stepped in close, his chest brushing hers. "Screw their perfection," he said, his voice low and fierce. "You're perfect like this, curves, fire, all of it." Her ears drooped, her golden eyes searching his, and for a second, she leaned into him, her hands resting on his chest, feeling the hard beat of his heart. "You don't get it," she whispered, but her fingers curled into his vest, pulling him closer, and the heat between them burned hotter than ever. The lab went from tense to total chaos when a blaring alarm ripped through the air, red lights flashing like a damn disco gone wrong. Lyraxa's comm device beeped again, but this time it wasn't Vaxer's grumpy voice, it was a robotic warning: "Unauthorized biomodification detected. Valerian drones deployed." Jake's head snapped up, his gray eyes narrowing. "Drones? They're onto us already?" Lyraxa's ears shot up, her green face paling as she grabbed his arm, her fingers digging into his bicep, warm and frantic. "They've got scanners everywhere, they know I'm still, like this," she said, her voice shaking, her full chest heaving against her stretched tunic. Jake didn't waste a second. He snatched her hand, his rough palm swallowing her soft green one, and yanked her toward the door. "We're outta here," he growled, pulling her close until her hip bumped his thigh, her curves pressing into him as they bolted. Her breath hitched, her thoughts slamming into his mind through their link. "We're screwed." "Not yet, babe," he shot back aloud, his grip tightening, feeling the heat of her skin under his fingers. They tore through Orion 7's shadowy corridors, the alarms screaming behind them. Jake led the way, dodging flickering lights and stray cables, his boots pounding the metal floor. Lyraxa stumbled, her new body still throwing her off, and he swung an arm around her waist, hauling her against his side. His hand slid low, brushing the swell of her backside for a split second before settling on her hip, gripping hard to keep her upright. "Stay with me," he said, voice rough and close, his breath grazing her ear. She gasped, her rabbit ears twitching fast, and her hand clutched his vest, fingers scraping the fabric as she leaned into him. Her chest pressed against his arm, soft and warm, and he could feel her heart racing. Hell, he could hear it in his head too. "You're too close," she panted, but her body didn't pull away, molding against his like she needed the anchor. They ducked into a narrow maintenance shaft, the walls tight and humming with machinery. Jake shoved her in first, then squeezed in behind, his chest brushing her back as they crawled through. The space was cramped, forcing them together. His hands landed on her hips again, guiding her forward, fingers digging into her curves through the tunic. Her skin burned under his touch, smooth and alive, and she shivered, her ears brushing his face as she moved. "Keep going," he murmured, his lips hovering near her neck, his breath hot against her green skin. Her thoughts slipped through, "This is insane," his hands. He smirked, giving her hips a light squeeze. "Yeah, you love it," he teased, and she elbowed him, weak and flustered, her cheeks glowing red even in the dim light. "Shut up," she hissed, but her hand reached back, brushing his arm, nails grazing him like she couldn't help it. They spilled out into a hangar bay, a small shuttle gleaming under the harsh lights. Jake dragged her toward it, his arm still looped around her waist, pulling her tight against his side. Her silver hair tickled his cheek, and he caught a whiff of that sweet alien scent. Damn, it was messing with his head. He shoved her into the pilot seat, then slid in beside her, their thighs pressing together in the tight cockpit. His hand landed on her knee, firm and warm, as he punched the controls to fire up the engines. "Buckle up," he said, his fingers sliding up her leg just a hair before pulling back, leaving a trail of heat. She sucked in a breath, her ears twitching, and fumbled with the straps, her hands brushing his as she moved. "You're enjoying this too much," she muttered, but her golden eyes flicked to his, sparking with something, fear, maybe, but definitely heat. The shuttle blasted off, shaking as it punched through Orion 7's docking bay into the black void. The gas giant loomed outside, a swirling monster of color, and Jake gripped the controls, his knuckles white. Lyraxa clutched the device in her lap, its buttons blinking like it was mocking them. "We can't go back now," she said, voice tight, her hand landing on his arm, fingers wrapping around his wrist. Her touch was soft, desperate, and he turned to her, his free hand sliding over hers, tangling their fingers together. "Then we figure it out here," he said, his thumb stroking her palm, slow and warm. Her breath hitched, her thoughts flooding his mind. "What if it's more than just my body?" He frowned, catching her eye. "What do you mean?" She hesitated, then flipped the device over, revealing a tiny screen flickering with Valyrian runes. "I scanned it in the shaft," she said, her voice trembling. "It's not just physical mods, it can mess with emotions, maybe even thoughts. What if this link between us isn't real?" Jake's stomach dropped, but he didn't let go of her hand. Instead, he pulled her closer, his arm sliding around her shoulders, tugging her against his chest. His fingers brushed her neck, tracing the edge of her jaw, feeling the pulse jumping there. "You think this is fake?" he asked, voice low and rough, his breath grazing her ear. Her hand pressed into his chest, fingers curling into his vest, and she shivered, her ears drooping. "I don't know," she whispered, but her body leaned into him, soft and warm, like it didn't care what the answer was. He tilted her chin up with his thumb, locking eyes with her, his other hand resting on her lower back, pulling her tighter. "Feels pretty damn real to me," he said, his voice husky, his lips hovering near hers, close enough to feel her shaky exhale. Her thoughts flickered through, "It does, too real." Her hand slid up his chest, fingers brushing his collarbone, nails scraping lightly as she held on. "Jake," she breathed, and he grinned, his hand sliding down her spine, splaying wide to feel every inch of her against him. "Yeah, that's me," he murmured, and for a second, they just sat there, tangled together in the shuttle's dim glow, the truth hanging heavy between them. Real or not, they were in deep. The shuttle screeched back into Orion 7's hangar bay, engines hissing as Jake killed the power. Time was up. The Valyrian Council was minutes away, and they still had a mess to clean up. Lyraxa clutched the device, her green fingers trembling, and Jake grabbed her hand, pulling her out of the cockpit. "We've got this," he said, his rough palm swallowing hers, his thumb brushing her knuckle slow and warm. Her golden eyes flicked to his, wide and nervous, but she nodded, her ears twitching as she leaned into him, her shoulder grazing his chest. They bolted back to the lab, her curves swaying with every step, and Jake couldn't help stealing a glance. Damn, she was still the hottest thing he'd ever seen, messed up tunic and all. In the lab, Jake punched Lyraxa's old body data into the device, his hands steady despite the sweat trickling down his neck. She stood beside him, close enough that her hip bumped his thigh, and he slid an arm around her waist, pulling her against the console. His fingers splayed across her lower back, brushing the swell of her curves, feeling the heat radiating off her green skin. "Hold still," he murmured, his breath grazing her ear, and she shivered, her rabbit ears quivering as she gripped his arm, nails digging into his bicep. He hit the button, and a green beam flashed out, wrapping her in light. When it faded, her slim, perfect Valerian shape was back, lithe and sleek, her tunic fitting like a glove again. But the mind link? That didn't budge. Jake caught her eye, grinning. "Still stuck with me up here," he tapped his temple, and her thought slipped through, "Good." Her cheeks flushed red, and she didn't pull away, her hand lingering on his arm, soft and warm. The lab door hissed open, an elder Vaxxer stormed in like a silver-robed tornado, his rabbit ears stiff with authority, golden eyes narrowed to slits. "Lyraxa, explain this delay," he barked, his voice cold and cutting, his gaze raking over her suspiciously. Jake stepped forward, his hand sliding to her shoulder, squeezing firm as he planted himself between her and Vaxxer. "We had a glitch, sir, but it's handled," he said, voice steady, his fingers brushing the base of her neck, feeling her pulse jump under his touch. Vaxxer's lip curled. "A human involved? Unacceptable. Lyraxa, you'll face review for this. Perfection tolerates no recklessness." She tensed under Jake's hand, her ears drooping, but his thoughts flooded her mind. "I've got you, babe." "She's brilliant," he said aloud, his grip tightening, his thumb tracing her collarbone slow and warm. "You'd be dumb as hell to punish her for doing her job." Vaxxer scoffed, his eyes flashing with disdain, but a flicker of doubt crossed his face. He muttered something about human insolence and swept out, leaving the air crackling behind him. The tension drained out of the room, and Jake tugged Lyraxa toward Orion 7's observation deck, away from the lab's chaos. The gas giant spun outside, a wild swirl of color under the Sirius stars, and he wrapped an arm around her waist, pulling her flush against his side. His fingers trailed up her spine, slow and deliberate, resting at the nape of her neck, feeling the silky strands of her silver hair slide through his grip. "You're still the hottest thing I've ever laid eyes on," he whispered, his breath tickling her rabbit ears, making them twitch fast. She leaned into him, her green skin glowing in the starlight, and her hand slid up his chest, fingers tracing the hard lines of his muscles through his vest. "And you're the messiest human I've ever met," she said, voice soft and teasing, her touch lingering, pressing into his pecs like she was memorizing them. "But I can't ditch you." Her golden eyes locked on his, sparking with something fierce, grace and fire all mixed up. Their thoughts tangled through the link, his bold, cocky confidence crashing into her calm, graceful vibe, and it felt right, like they'd fused into something unstoppable. Jake tilted her chin up with his thumb, his other hand sliding down her back, splaying wide to pull her tighter against him. Her curves might be gone, but she still fit him perfectly, her body warm and alive under his hands. "Guess we broke every rule in the book," he said, voice low and rough, his lips hovering near hers, close enough to feel her shaky breath. Her hand rested on his neck, fingers brushing his jaw, soft and sure, and she smiled, a real one, small but bright. "Yeah, and I'd do it again," she whispered, her thoughts echoing, "with you." The device sat on a table nearby, forgotten for now, but its screen blinked one last time, bonding harmony achieved. Jake didn't care what it meant, tech could say whatever it wanted. This was real. He leaned in, closing the gap, and their lips met in a slow, tender kiss. It started soft, her mouth warm and sweet against his, but he deepened it, his hand sliding up to cradle her neck, thumb stroking her jaw as he pulled her closer. Her fingers dug into his vest, tugging him in, her body pressing flush against his chest, soft and firm all at once. His other hand roamed her back, tracing every line, feeling the heat of her through the tunic, and she sighed into him, her ears trembling as his breath grazed them. It was hot, messy, perfect, a kiss that defied space, rules, and every stuck-up council out there. They pulled back just enough to breathe, foreheads resting together, his hands still on her neck, hers still on his chest. "You're mine now, Doc," he murmured, grinning, his fingers brushing her ear, making her shiver. She laughed, low and warm, her hand sliding down his arm, squeezing his bicep. "And you're mine, you reckless idiot," she shot back, her thoughts slipping through, "always." Under the stars, with the universe spinning wild outside, they stood there, tangled up in each other, two rebels who'd rewritten perfection their own damn way.